Oh, I didn't see you there. I was just pretending to use a magnifying glass. It's the most famous assassination in history, the death of a power-thirsty wannabe emperor of Rome. A group of men take turns at the tyrant until he sees even the noble Brutus is with them. "Et tu, Brute? And you, Brutus?" Caesar asks before collapsing. But how much of what we think of with Julius Caesar is actually true? What's Shakespeare's dramatization in the year 1599, and what actually happened to Caesar in 44 BCE? To solve this mystery, we'll dig into historical sources and compare that to Shakespeare's retelling. First, a thank you to all my patrons for making this historical exploration possible. Support history on YouTube by going to patreon.com/WilliamCFox. Today we're going to be exploring some Roman history starting in the year 44 BCE. The assassination of Julius Caesar has been portrayed in countless pieces of art, film, and theatrical productions. I mean, you could probably count them, but I'm not going to. The popular consciousness of Caesar's death permeates 2,000 years of history. Even in the USA, where presidential assassinations of Lincoln and JFK enthrall the popular imagination, nothing supersedes Julius, the man for whom the month of July is named. The reality of 44 BCE is muddled by Shakespeare's play, The Tragedy of Julius Caesar, written in 1599. The play encompasses the lead-up to the assassination, including the interactions between Brutus and Cassius, and features famous orations after the deed is done. The play was so successful, however, that the drama has mixed with the truth. Indeed, as a work of historical fiction, that's kind of the point. Shakespeare's objective is entertainment, not historical accuracy. Shakespeare didn't draw his story from thin air, however. He used the account of Greek biographer Plutarch. Specifically, he read a translation of Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans, Life of Caesar, and Life of Brutus. This is our first piece of evidence, and evidence is going to be our guiding star. When writing the tragedy of Julius Caesar, Shakespeare leaned heavily on the events recounted by Plutarch. So how reliable is Plutarch? Well, let's take a look. He wrote a parallel biography of Caesar and Alexander the Great, and lucky for us, at the beginning of his Life of Alexander, he tells us his intention in writing about Caesar. Quote, "For I am writing biography, not history." Well, Plutarch, what does that even mean? Let's look at some of the context around this. I do not recall all their most celebrated achievements or describe any of them exhaustively, but merely summarize for the most part what they accomplished. It is my task to dwell upon those actions which illuminate the workings of the soul. So Plutarch isn't looking to mislead or invent, but his focus is personal. I mean, this is a vague line a lot of ancient philosophers ride. Look at Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. At the start, he basically says, hey, I'm gonna paraphrase some speeches that I didn't even attend. I'm just gonna write what I think they might have said given the circumstances. Well, what? I mean, this doesn't discount the sources, it just means we have to deal with them carefully. Lucky for us, we have some other clues when solving this mystery. Though Shakespeare didn't use them, there are 4 other sources historians typically look at when analyzing the death of Caesar: Appian, Cassius Dio, Nicolaus of Damascus, and Suetonius. We'll look at these sources in more detail as needed during our investigation. We'll also bring in Cicero, who may have seen the assassination with his own eyes. In the meantime, it's enough to understand our task. We'll look at Shakespeare's dramatization and compare it to the sources to see if there's any evidence for the portrayal. And by the way, I'm using Barry Strauss's The Death of Caesar as a guidepost secondary source. In his book, he also looks at the 5 main sources on the assassination and references other scholarly sources which also analyze the main sources. So yeah, that's a complicated way of saying follow my entire paper trail with the source animations in the corner and the list in the description. One more thing, this is a work of pop history. As in, I'm telling a fun story because everybody likes to hear about a scandal and a big man getting his just desserts. It's not the most substantive thing we could talk about, and importantly, it's a story that focuses on the powerful. I don't just mean powerful as in Caesar, I mean that even all the historians we'll look at today were powerful, elites of society. Their point of view focuses on that of their own class, the problems of their strata. Ordinary people, disempowered, oppressed people won't be featured in our investigation today. What I'm saying is that this video is like fast food history. Enjoy it as a treat, but don't forget to seek variety in your diet too. There's more to Roman history than battles and marble busts. All right, now let's open our investigation. Rome is traditionally said to have been founded roughly 753 BCE. This beginning was marked by a couple centuries of absolute monarchies until 509 BCE. The next 500-year period is that of the Roman Republic, when Rome's influence began to expand dramatically. But Rome's republic didn't remain stable. The roughly 100 years before Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE were marked by a normalization of political violence. Though Caesar is the most infamous example, Roman life was scarred by other examples of political violence in 133 BCE, 121 BCE, 100 BCE, 79 BCE, and 73 BCE. There are more cases than I can list here. Mobs and paramilitary groups killing officials, political opponents, Spartacus's slave uprising. There's a quick rundown in Mary Beard's History of Ancient Rome, Chapter 6, if you want to read further. The point is that by the time Caesar was stabbed by a group of senators, it wasn't like an unheard of thing. People had been falling victim to groups of senators on the semi-regular. Why are they wearing all those white clothes if they're just going to go around stabbing people? Why did people want Caesar dead? It wasn't a new sentiment. From 49 BCE until 45 BCE, Caesar commanded against his rival Pompey in a civil war, a war kicked off by Caesar's famous crossing of the Rubicon, the northern border of Italy towards Rome. Sidebar, it's never been proven exactly which river, if any, Caesar crossed. In popular imagination, the Rubicon is a roaring, beastly body of water, kind of like Washington's crossing of the Delaware. There is a modern named river called Rubicon, but it's not particularly impressive, and to quote Wikipedia, yes, Wikipedia, don't you question me. There's no one there. While it has not been proven, most historians believe the two rivers are indeed one and the same, citation needed. So the Rubicon might be this river, or it might be some random trickling stream that's long since dried up. How epic. Here's a real source. Alright, so Caesar crosses the Rubicon, kicking off the civil war with Pompey. In the summer of 45 BCE, the summer before his assassination, Caesar strode triumphantly into Rome. Among those with him was one of his generals and likely future consul, Mark Antony, important for both the historical account and Shakespeare's. Also, there was Marcus Brutus, the central figure in Shakespeare's play. During the Civil War, Brutus had initially sided with Pompey against Caesar, but after capture, Brutus asked for and received pardon from Caesar. Brutus then moved quickly into Caesar's inner orbit, becoming governor of Gaul. Caesar even promised to make him one of the 2 Roman consuls in 41 BCE. Importantly, Brutus hoped with the civil war behind them, Caesar would return the power to traditional elite, the Roman Senate. Oh, and one more thing, Caesar and Brutus's mom, Servilia, well, they were kind of in love with each other. Okay, so now with a little context, let's get to the scene of the crime. William Shakespeare picks up Caesar's story 6 months later in 44 BCE. Act 1, Scene 2 of Shakespeare's play. Caesar enters the streets of Rome with a posse and a crowd. He's confronted by a soothsayer, a seer, who tells him, "Beware the Ides of March." Ides of March meaning March 15th, an important date in the Roman calendar. The guy's telling Caesar to be careful. Caesar dismisses the man as a dreamer. Later in the play, Act 3, on the actual Ides of March, the same soothsayer reappears. Upon seeing him, Caesar says basically, "Oh hey, it's the day of your big prediction, soothsayer, and it's all good. The Ides of March are come," says Caesar. To which the soothsayer responds, "Aye, Caesar, but not gone." Now, given the foreshadowing, the recall later on, the dramatic flair, we'd be justified in dismissing this anecdote as a clever bit of theater. However, it's actually something Shakespeare lifted directly from his source, Plutarch. Here we are. Plutarch writes, "A certain seer warned Caesar to be on his guard against a great peril on the day of the month of March, which the Romans call the Ides. And when the day had come and Caesar was on his way to the Senate house, he greeted the seer with a jest and said, "Well, the Ides of March are come." And the seer said to him softly, "Aye, they are come, but they are not gone." This exchange also appears in another source, Appian's Histories. Clue number 2, quote, "On the Ides of March, which day the soothsayer predicted that he should not survive." Now, similar to Plutarch, Appian is writing well after the events he writes about. In Appian's case, the 2nd century CE. However, like Plutarch, he's pulling from ancient sources which have been lost to time. So whether you believe this anecdote ultimately comes down to whether you believe Plutarch and Appian, and therein, if we believe the sources they worked from, which we no longer have. Notable among those potential sources, the Roman historian Livy, who lived and wrote during Caesar's time. His works have been referenced by generations of historians. Unfortunately, though, the portion of his histories that deals with Caesar has been lost. Now, about the same time Caesar's swaggering through the streets in Shakespeare's play, Brutus is pulled aside by Cassius, another Roman senator. Cassius is portrayed here by Shakespeare as the main instigator of the conspiracy. In the play, he tries to pull Brutus into the plot by convincing him Caesar has gotten too powerful, like a king. Quote, "He doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs." And a bit later, quote, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings." Shakespeare pulls this portrayal of Cassius as the main instigator from Plutarch, as you might expect, who wrote that it was a conspiracy of Marcus Brutus, quote, "and Cassius." It's backed up by another of our historical clues, clue 3, Suetonius. Quote, "More than 60 joined the conspiracy against him, led by Gaius Cassius and Marcus and Decimus Brutus." Suetonius is another Roman historian and biographer who did most of his writing in the 2nd century CE. Working for Emperor Hadrian in the Roman archives and libraries, he had access to countless treasures lost to us. He used the access to write about the lives of whom he described as illustrious Romans, and also of early Roman emperors, whom he calls the 12 Caesars, the real Caesar among them. He's known as a straight shooter in his writing, no obvious agenda, and including different points of view. Here's the Britannica article on him claiming he had a knack for using the mot juste. That's pretentious for using just the right word. On the other hand, Suetonius had a lot of salacious details in his works. We might call it tabloid today. So all this tells us we can say with relative confidence that Shakespeare accurately portrays Cassius as the main ringleader along with Brutus. What's murkier and difficult to know is their motivation for doing so. In Shakespeare, Brutus is bothered by Caesar's dictatorial power. He admits he's uncomfortable with Caesar's accumulation of accolades and titles, but falls short of calling for his death. He's afraid Caesar will be king and complains of endless honors. And at the exact moment Brutus is explaining this to Cassius in the play, there are noises off stage. Mark Antony is offering Caesar a crown before a crowd, who cheers him on to take it. Caesar, however, turns it down not once, but thrice, 3 times, a forced and insincere humility, a piece of populist theater. "Oh, crown? Oh, no, a crown. I couldn't possibly take a crown. Give me that crown." Shakespeare pulled this detail about Caesar refusing a crown 3 times from Plutarch. Quote, "But when Caesar pushed away the diadem, aka the crown, all the people applauded, and when Antony offered it again, few, and when Caesar declined it again, all applauded." But does this anecdote appear in other sources? Yes. Not just Plutarch, but Appian and Suetonius share this detail too. Suetonius even adds an interesting bit of dialogue in which he claims Caesar says, "I am Caesar and no king." Interesting in retrospect, since the name Caesar serves as the basis for the word king or emperor in a couple languages, Tsar in Russian, Kaiser in German. Our other clues, Nicolaus and Cassius Dio, mention it as well, but more on them later. What's exciting with this detail about the crown is that we get an even closer source than these Roman historians. We get someone who actually lived alongside Caesar, was a Roman senator in 44 BCE, and may have even witnessed the assassination of Caesar in person. It's time for clue number 4, Cicero's oration. You've no doubt heard the name Cicero before. He's one of the most famous Roman orators, statesmen, lawyers, philosophers, the list goes on. In Shakespeare, the conspirators decide not to involve Cicero because he's too proud to join a conspiracy of any kind. In Act 2, Scene 1, Brutus says of Cicero, "For he will not follow anything that other men begin." There's no evidence for any of this, by the way. It's not clear to us in hindsight why Cicero didn't join the conspiracy, nor that there was a lot of deliberation on whether to invite him to do so. However, a year after Caesar's death, Cicero gave a series of speeches denouncing Mark Antony, and in one of them he references the incident when Antony offered Caesar the crown. Quote, "You placed the diadem, crown, on his head amid the groans of the people. He rejected it amid great applause. You then alone, O wicked man, were found both to advise the assumption of kingly power and to wish to have him for your master." We'll visit Cicero again. We have to take the details of what he said with a huge grain of salt. This is, after all, an overtly political speech. I would just like to point out, though, that just because something is political doesn't mean it's false. Someone was the first person to call Richard Nixon a crook, and it turns out Nixon was a crook. Okay, sidebar over. No, actually, double sidebar. Everything is political anyway. There's no such thing as a non-political source. Political as in the Greek word polis, meaning city. Politics, then, is the affairs of the city. All of them. The affairs of communities down to the nuclear family, towns, loose confederations, or communist superstate unions. If you ever hear a hack say, "This is not political, it's just common sense," tell him William C. Fox would like a word sometime in the future. Cicero's political speech, alongside the 5 other clues we have, lead one to strongly conclude the anecdote with the crown is true, with some disagreement on the details. But this anecdote alone can't be enough to justify an assassination. What else was going on? It's clear that in the aftermath of the Civil War, there was pressure on Caesar to bend to precedent and defer to the traditional power structure of the elites in the Roman Senate. Caesar, on the other hand, seemed eager to maintain and expand his power. Ultimately, he sought empire. When we imagine the assassination of Julius Caesar today, particularly when coupled with Shakespeare, we often buy into this dichotomy. Republic-loving senators, democracy versus wannabe despots. The story isn't necessarily wrong, but it is romanticized. Are we really to believe each and every one of the dozens of conspirators participated out of indignant, justifiable self-righteousness? Many of the senators had some of their own personal ambitions fulfilled through Caesar's acquisition of power. How might they have benefited from his death? In short, we tend to focus on principle when we might look at interest instead. Even if we accept, for the sake of argument, that each conspirator was fighting for the honor and longevity of the Roman Republic, we shouldn't let the word republic dupe us. In this definition of republic, we're merely referring to the absence of a king. Earlier, Rome had kings, and when the monarchy was abolished, they had a republic, by definition, as in a government having a chief of state who was not a monarch. However, despite the republic label, Roman politics was clearly run by an aristocracy, an elite. Sure, the paradigm was emerging that government had a positive role to play in people's lives. Roman citizens voted, for example, and that's why so many Roman emperors went to great lengths to flood Rome with grain and provide public games. The mob could rumble the power base, and so therefore a rudiment of a social contract was in play. But power did not lay with the people, the demos prefix in the word democracy. If the conspirators were fighting for the republic, it was not the kind of modern, freedom-loving Western democracy we have somewhere in our heads. It was a hierarchy with a few at the top. Anyone out there watching this, your hot takes on the modern parallels are welcome in the comments below. No memes, please. There are, of course, historical accounts that Caesar was amassing so much power, breaking all precedent. And critically, he was set to leave for a military campaign in the east just a few days after the Ides of March, a campaign which most definitely would return him as the first emperor of Rome. So, other factors we'll discuss momentarily considered, there was also a deadline for action. Shakespeare had a different deadline in his play. In Act 1, Scene 3, Cassius says that tomorrow the Senate will officially make Caesar king. So, both the reality and the fiction had a dramatic deadline. Cicero wrote in a letter that he heard Caesar was coming to Rome for an extended period to settle things. I'm paraphrasing. Cicero references Caesar's upcoming campaign, then writes, quote, "He will not go against the Parthians until everything is settled at home." Emphasis mine. So what was Caesar doing? Well, for a start, he was currying favor with the masses, offering lavish games, rent reduction, public feasts, new public works, temples, infusing his personal wealth into public life, something he must have seen as an investment. At the same time, he was pulling the strings of power behind the scenes, ensuring his allies were vaulted to the top, and those who had been loyal to his rival Pompey would at least play ball with him in exchange for forgiveness, kind of like Brutus. But public spending and promoting friends is hardly groundbreaking. There's more. Caesar wasn't afraid to flaunt his foreign successes, nor his victories in the civil war, Roman against Roman. This proved uncomfortable as he marched soldiers through the streets of the capital. As Plutarch wrote, quote, "For it commemorated no victory over foreign commanders or barbarian kings, but the utter annihilation of the sons and the family of the mightiest of Romans." Speaking of soldiers, Caesar paid his troops, from normal soldiers to the highest officers, huge bonuses upon victory, sometimes 25 times their normal salary. Any observer could note the shifting loyalty of the civilian military to one man's personal militia. In February of 44 BCE, the Senate voted to make Caesar dictator in perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, aka dictator for life, presumably something troubling for the conspirators in the Senate that would go on to end Caesar's life. Appian says he was proclaimed the father of the country, pater patriae in Latin, and chosen dictator for life. Perhaps more disturbing than the worldly titles bestowed upon him were the otherworldly, immortal honors he was receiving. The Senate voted to give Caesar divine honors, to use their institution to vote him into a living god, divine Julius, divus Julius. Statues of him went up around the city, this collection of accolades, even divine ones involving temples and priests, were those to which Brutus refers in Shakespeare's play. But here's a mystery within our mystery. Why did the same Senate which gave Caesar these honors also find them so excessive they needed to kill him? They voted for it. Were they all coerced? To answer, we need to emulate a little Shakespeare and head over to his preferred source, Plutarch. Plutarch mentions that the entirety of the Senate was in it at the start. Everyone wanted to throw a few nice titles Caesar's way. He won the Civil War after all. But then the snowball got out of hand, quote, "But others added excessive honors and vied with one another in proposing them, thus rendering Caesar odious and obnoxious, even to the mildest citizens because of the pretension and extravagance of what was decreed for him." So basically, a competition started to see who could suck up to Caesar the most. He goes on to suggest that some of Caesar's enemies in the Senate might have encouraged all this to make Caesar look ridiculous. Again, I suggest to you that not all conspirators were acting merely out of principle, but interest as well. To add fuel to the fire, while the Senate was spitting out honorary titles, Caesar was disrespecting the institution that was propelling him ever higher. One famous incident garners the attention of several of our authors. The clues they leave to the real story makes me so disappointed we don't have like a video of it. Here's an outline of the incident. After voting for all these honors, accolades, and titles, the Senate decided to formally visit Caesar and offer them a little surprise party. They put on their nicest Senate robe, toga thing, grabbed a crowd of onlookers, and headed to Caesar's location. The whole thing comes off like a failed prom proposal, because, get this, when they arrive and greeted Caesar, he didn't rise to greet them. Here's where the disagreement kicks in. Plutarch, Appian, Suetonius tell us that Caesar disrespected the group because he didn't stand up. Plutarch even mentions a quip where Caesar jokingly says that the group should reduce the number of honors as they've gotten a little much. This was the moment that turned some senators into conspirators. But there's a hot debate. Maybe Caesar wasn't being disrespectful. Maybe he was just busy. Maybe he physically couldn't stand up. Maybe the senators didn't become conspirators in this moment. Maybe they were already so and just looking for a pretext. Such doubt comes to us from two sources, Cassius Dio and Nicolaus of Damascus, clues 5 and 6, and our more pro-Caesar anti-conspirator sources. Cassius Dio was a Roman soldier in the 3rd century CE, a senator in the early empire, and held a variety of public offices which afforded him access in time to historical work. And Cassius mentions the excuses that Caesar's apologists used in defending this lack of standing up and receiving the Senate's honors with humility. Quote, "Some who subsequently tried to defend him claimed, it is true, that owing to an attack of diarrhea, he could not control the movement of his bowels, and so had remained where he was in order to avoid a flux." Yes, maybe Caesar had to poop, and his subsequent assassination was all a big misunderstanding. Who brought me this clue? This is a great clue. Who am I kidding? I'm all alone. A more interesting take comes from clue number 6, Nicolaus of Damascus. The account of Nicolaus of Damascus, by the way, is the earliest historical account we have today of Caesar's assassination. Quote, "Caesar was seated while they advanced, and because he was conversing with men standing to one side, he did not turn his head towards the approaching procession or pay any attention to it, but continued to prosecute the business which he had on hand, until one of his friends nearby said, 'Look at these people coming up in front of you.' Then Caesar laid down his papers and turned around." Nicolaus is telling us to chill out. Caesar was busy and attentive to the tasks of governance before him. Those senators, with their sniveling honors, interrupted. Now, Nicolaus has reasons for framing things this way. In fact, his entire account of the assassination has this pro-Caesar vibe to it. And that's because Nicolaus was working for Caesar's chosen successor, Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Just to drive home the point, the Nicolaus account of Caesar's assassination comes to us in the surviving pieces of the book called The Life of Augustus. The purpose here is to draw a straight line through the youth of his boss, through the death of Caesar, leading to the righteous rise of Emperor Augustus. So yeah, Nicolaus tends to portray the conspirators in a negative light. I'll wrap up this conversation on motivation with one final note from Cicero. In the same year Caesar was assassinated, Cicero wrote De Officiis. As far as we know, he was not a part of the conspiracy to end Caesar's life. Nonetheless, he gives an aristocrat, establishment, if you like, defense of the plot. "Our tyrant deserved his death for having made an exception of the one thing that was the blackest crime of all. Behold, here you have a man who was ambitious to be king of the Roman people and master of the whole world, and he achieved it. The man who maintains that such an ambition is morally right is a madman, for he justifies the destruction of laws and liberty and thinks their hideous and detestable suppression glorious." So now we can come full circle. In Shakespeare, Brutus is bothered by Caesar's dictatorial powers. He admits he's uncomfortable with Caesar's accumulation of accolades and titles. He's afraid Caesar will be king and complains of endless honors. He receives messages, framed as though from ordinary Romans, telling him to "Awake, Brutus, thou sleepest, awake," a part of the play for which there is also historical evidence. Brutus decides to join the conspiracy. He utters a famous passage, "And therefore think him as a serpent's egg, which hatched would as his kind grow mischievous, and kill him in the shell." But we can't directly know the mind of Brutus, or really any of the conspirators. We can say from the examination of our clues that Shakespeare's rough shape rings true. The amassing of power, the crown, disrespecting the Senate for whatever reason. Caesar made enemies. Those enemies, out of principle, interest, both ended his life. So let's flesh out a few rapid-fire details before we get to comparing Shakespeare's account of the moment of assassination with the description in our various clues. Number 1. In Shakespeare, there is a conspirator named Casca. He describes visions, such as seeing a lion in Rome and a man with his hand on fire, but without burns. Violent thunderstorms. While all 5 of our Roman historians reference Casca and his participation in the plot against Caesar, I didn't find any evidence of visions like in the play. Number 2, in Shakespeare, there is a discussion of Mark Antony. Remember, Antony is the one who put the crown on Caesar's head in the stage spectacle. In the play, Cassius suggests that the right-hand man of Caesar fall with him, as in, let's kill Antony too. Brutus implores them not to. It would appear too violent. They would overplay their hand with the public. And remember, the conspirators would need the public to accept the assassination of Caesar. Brutus uses a metaphor, comparing Antony to an appendage that will prove useless once the head, Caesar, is gone. For he can do no more than Caesar's arm when Caesar's head is off. Each of our clues references Antony and his support of Caesar. At least in the account of Plutarch and Cassius Dio are references to a plan to kill Antony along with Caesar, and a similar reason for not doing so. They would look too violent. Number 3, Shakespeare portrays Caesar as deaf in one ear. In a conversation with Antony, he says, "Come on my right hand, for this ear is deaf." No source mentions deafness, not even Shakespeare's preferred source, Plutarch. So Shakespeare likely invented this detail. Number 4, in Act 2 of Shakespeare's play, Calpurnia urges Caesar not to leave the house on the Ides of March. She's been plagued with nightmares of his murder. Believe it or not only is there evidence for this account, the accounts in our clues are actually a tad more dramatic than Shakespeare. Plutarch references Calpurnia's nightmare and that during them, quote, all the windows and doors of the chamber flew open at once, for she dreamed, as it proved, that she was holding her murdered husband in her arms and bewailing him. Appian mentions it too. Quote, his wife, Calpurnia, had a dream in which she saw him streaming with blood, for which she tried to prevent him from going out in the morning. Suetonius and Nicolaus write of the dreams as well. Number 5, and final rapid-fire detail. In response to Calpurnia's pleas for him to avoid the Senate, in Shakespeare's play, Caesar asks for a priest to perform a sacrifice to bring him an omen. After reading some animal guts, the advice comes that Caesar should stay home and not attend the Senate that day. Once again, this detail is found in our clues. Appian, quote, when he offered sacrifice, there were many unfavorable signs. Suetonius, then, after several victims had been slain and he could not get favorable omens, he entered the house in defiance of portents. Plutarch, the seers also, after many sacrifices, told him that the omens were unfavorable. So with bad dreams and bad omens, how did Caesar end up going to the Senate chamber? In Shakespeare, Decius enters the scene on a mission to convince Caesar to leave his house. He comes up with a pretty good reason. The Senate is going to officially make him king. If he doesn't come, they won't. And know it now, the Senate have concluded to give this day a crown to mighty Caesar. If you shall send them word you will not come, their minds may change. FOMO, Caesar, FOMO. Shakespeare lifted this from Plutarch, as we're accustomed to by now. Appian, Cassius Dio, Nicolaus, and Suetonius include this detail too, each with a similar version of Decius shows up, derides the omens, makes fun of the bad dreams, implies Caesar shouldn't disrespect the Senate, and then Caesar goes. The reason I put Decius in air quotes is because there is one detail that Shakespeare gets wrong, probably on purpose. The name of this person is not Decius, but rather Decimus. Now we finally get into the assassination itself. As Caesar heads to the Senate meeting, Shakespeare sets the scene for us in a street near the Capitol, as in Capitol with an O, building in Rome. This detail is great for theatrics and of course has led to paintings and movies setting their interpretations of the assassination in dynamic Rome, the great capital of pillars and statues. It's extra convenient as a storyteller because when the conspirators go out to justify their actions to the public, they don't have to get on a horse and travel for an hour, stop to use the bathroom, sit in carriage traffic, then make a dramatic speech. Here, my people, is why I did it. No, the scene is in the middle of Rome. After the deed is done, they walk straight out of the Senate chamber, and the story continues. However, Caesar was not assassinated in the center of Rome, nor in the Capitol building. The scene of the assassination was, get this, the Theater of Pompey, which lays to the west of the center of Rome. The Roman Senate wasn't limited to a single chamber, and it just happens that Caesar would die in this place of poetic justice. Why is it poetic justice that he was killed in the Theater of Pompey? Pompey is the man Caesar defeated in the Civil War, a ghost's revenge. In Shakespeare's dramatization, Caesar approaches the chamber from the city street to much fanfare. We already addressed the soothsayer with whom he has a back and forth. "The Ides of March are come," says Caesar. "Aye, Caesar, but not gone," says the soothsayer. But there's also this. A man named Artemidorus awaits with a paper warning Caesar of the plot against him. "If thou beest not immortal, look about you. Security gives way to conspiracy." But Caesar passes by. Artemidorus implores him to read it over and over, but is shooed away by conspirators around him. It's another dramatic anecdote. I think it's the CEO of Pixar that describes storytelling as tension over time. Well, here we have a layer of tension, build-up. As an audience, we see this close call. If only Caesar would just take the paper, history would be different. Marcel, burn it down. An alternative history is waiting. However, once again, we can place the dramatic flair on the historians, not Shakespeare. And it might just be that dramatic flair, but it's here in 3 of our clues. In Plutarch, Artemidorus pleads in the street, "Read this, Caesar, by thyself, and speedily, for it contains matters of importance and of concern to thee." In Appian's account, Artemidorus runs to the Senate as fast as he can to warn Caesar, but arrives too late, with Caesar, quote, in his death throes. But the tension over time, the soothsayer's warning, Artemidorus' pleas, aren't all. Shakespeare also throws in a third layer of drama. Maybe the conspirators have been found out, betrayed. Another man, Popilius, approaches the leader of the conspiracy, Cassius, and wishes him well in his enterprise, wink wink, which leads Cassius to believe their plot is uncovered. Popilius: "I wish your enterprise today may thrive." Cassius: "What enterprise, Popilius?" Popilius: "Fare you well." "Hey, whoa, no, bro, hey, vague guy, come, where you going?" After this moment with Cassius, Popilius ups the ante. He approaches Caesar himself and starts up a conversation that the conspirators, and by extension, we as an audience, can't hear. Is he revealing the plot to Caesar? Let's turn to our clues. The evidence is split. Plutarch writes about Popilius's ominous conversation with the conspirators. Popilius Lanus, a senator, who then whispered quietly to them, "I join you in praying for the accomplishment of what you have in mind, and exhort you not to delay, for the matter is on men's tongues." But he doesn't mention Popilius approaching Caesar. Appian is the opposite. He does mention Popilius talking to Caesar. He accosted Caesar and engaged him aside in earnest conversation. But Appian doesn't mention the ominous conversation with the conspirators. Honestly, this anecdote doesn't have the backing that some of the others do. In any event, both Plutarch and Appians, in fact all of our historians, have Caesar making his way through the crowd and into the Senate house. Caesar goes into the chamber. The Senate rises in acknowledgement. And even if you've never read or seen Shakespeare's tragedy, you surely have this iconic image in your head of all the senators surrounding Caesar and the anticipation of the moment. A lot of performances have a throne-looking chair as a centerpiece, and all the senators gather around and behind the chair, closing in on Caesar. All our clues mention the surrounding, the enroaching, and Plutarch, Suetonius, and Appian mention the chair. Cassius and Nicolaus make it seem more like Caesar is standing and everyone approaches from all angles. Dramatic either way. Is Caesar aware of what's happening at this point? Probably not. It appears like the normal commotion. People ask things of him, call his name, grovel. Apparently even senators did this. In Shakespeare's play, a man named Metellus Cimber approaches, petitioning that his banished brother be unbanished. He's distracting while everyone gets into position. Metellus Cimber throws before thy seat a humble heart. Is there no voice more worthy than my own to sound more sweetly in great Caesar's ear for the repealing of my banished brother? Ooh, it's getting tense now, so I'll pick up the pace too. Plutarch, Appian, Nicolaus, and Suetonius mention Cimber's petition, though they call him Tilius Cimber. Well, it's 4 or 5. Cassius doesn't mention him, but the whole setup is the same. Caesar is surrounded and people are conversing and petitioning. Shakespeare has everyone grovel and beg Caesar to listen. Brutus, Cassius, Cinna, Decius, Casca, though they were obviously there, there's no evidence this specific group said these things, nor that they took a knee to do it, as directors often block it in the show. All of the historical clues, with the exception of Cassius, say Cimber then tugs on Caesar's toga, the signal to the conspirators to start. In Shakespeare, Casca pulls on Caesar's toga all the way back in Act 1, perhaps a bit of foreshadowing. Here's the dramatic climax. Casca is the first to plunge his dagger into Caesar. Nicolaus, Suetonius, Appian, and Plutarch show it this way too. Casca goes for Caesar's neck, but ends up in the upper chest. Suetonius claims Caesar yelled, "Why, this is violence," in realization of the attack. Plutarch says he yelled, "Casca, what doest thou?" All the conspirators took at least one stab. There were probably 300 present in the Senate that day, and at least 20 were conspirators. Nicolaus says he was stabbed 35 times, Suetonius 23. In any event, all but Cassius Dio says Caesar fought back, though he was obviously overwhelmed. And when he's crumpled on the ground, bloodied and weak, that's when our playwright, William Shakespeare, writes an iconic exchange. In his final weak breaths, Caesar looks up to see Brutus, the statesman, the man he had forgiven, promoted, Servilia's son. The cruel betrayal. His last words, "Et tu, Brute?" And you, Brutus? This line of Shakespeare, "Et tu, Brute," has become so famous, so representative of the ultimate betrayal, many mistakenly believe it happened just like this. It didn't. Sorry, everyone. The juiciest detail is fake. But before you get after me, several of our ancient sources reference some dramatic anecdote between Caesar and Brutus. Plutarch says that once Caesar saw Brutus, he covered his head and resigned himself to the dagger strokes. Appian agrees, quote, "After receiving the wound from Brutus, he at last despaired, and veiling himself with his robe, composed himself for death." Suetonius and Cassius Dio give us an actual piece of dialogue. They say that Caesar looked up at Brutus and asked, "You too, my child?" I should add, though, both Suetonius and Cassius hedge their bets here a little bit. Cassius writes, quote, "Some have added that to Brutus, when he struck him a powerful blow, he said, 'You too, my child?' And Suetonius, quote, "Though some have written that when Marcus Brutus rushed at him, he said in Greek, 'You too, my child?' So even these two alone out of the 5 ancient sources in referencing any dialogue between the two at all are only admitting that some have said. I'll let you decide if that's enough evidence. In any event, Shakespeare's "Et tu, Brute" is his creation. Another created Shakespearean line adds a perfect bow on the scene. Cinna yells over Caesar's corpse, "Liberty, freedom, tyranny is dead." While there's no evidence for this line, there is one thing all 6 of our clues and Shakespeare agree on. Caesar was dead. I think you'll agree after all those details we've hashed out together that while Shakespeare did take many liberties in writing his play, particularly in dealing with motivation, he also didn't just pull things out of nowhere. It's no surprise his tragedy muddles our view of the real history. Both the story developed from historical sources and the work of Shakespeare tell the tale of men who sought to give rebirth to their society, a quixotic act which represented a reset button. Caesar was changing the Roman state. The conspirators were to stop that change with one act of violence. It's impossible to set aside noble intentions from personal ambition. As usual in politics, they intertwine. The lesson is troubling, but not surprising. Caesar's assassination is a single act, killing a single man. But Rome's problems were various, and they didn't go away with Caesar's death. In fact, another civil war was to follow, introducing yet more complication. A simple, dramatic act like an assassination might create change, but probably not the systemic change desired. And that concludes our investigation of this history mystery. Click here to watch other videos of mine. If you have a suggestion for another mystery for us to tackle together, tweet me at William C. Fox. Later, y'all.